Okay, I want to just get some of this personal stuff out. Time goes by so fast in this. You learn in here that Yitzhak Rabin, who was the chief of staff of the army, had a nervous breakdown?
He did. He had a physical and nervous breakdown. Yeah.
Did he ever admit this?
Eventually did, yes.
And when did he have this?
He had it about a week into the crisis. A week after Egyptian forces entered Sinai, and a week after the Egyptians evicted UNEF.
But before the June 5th...
Well before, 2 weeks before.
Attack.
2 weeks before.
You also learned that Moshe Dayan had a nervous breakdown in the 73 war.
73 war he did, yes. Very similar to Rabin's.
Did he admit that?
He basically had it very publicly. It was difficult to not admit it.
And what does it look like, a nervous, for both of these gentlemen?
Well, with Rabin's it happened behind the scenes. Nobody saw it. He just simply disappeared for 36 hours. Diane had been interviewed on TV and was semi-comatose in 73. And it was quite clear the man was going through severe emotional stress. So it was very difficult to disguise it. The rumor was put out that Rabin had suffered a bout of nicotine poisoning, and only many years later he came out and said that the pressure on him, and I think this comes out in the book, that this just indescribable pressure on Israeli leaders in the period leading up to the war as they try to fight a way not to have a war. Everyone was struggling not to get a war. Just became insufferable.
Well, go back to Nasser for a minute. How long did he live?
Nasser lived till September of 1970. He negotiated a ceasefire in the Jordanian Civil War, what the Palestinians call Black September, and then he died. But he was already an ill man by 1967. He suffered from severe diabetes.
How about Amer? When did he die?
Well, that's an issue in Egypt to this day.
Did he try to commit suicide?
The official version is that he committed suicide in August of 1967 after he tried to launch an abortive coup against Nasser. Anti-Nasserist forces in Egypt today will tell you that Amer was assassinated. Amer was executed by Nasser, and it remains a point of contention within Egyptian society.
We need to close the loop on Sadat's meeting in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
When he went to meet with the Soviets, they told him that the troops were on the border. Did he come back? Did Sadat come back and what did he tell Nasser?
He told him just what the Soviets said. And then the Soviets expect Egypt to come to Syria's aid.
What was Nasser's relationship then with the United States?
Very, very tense. As bad as it can be. Nasser had come to blows almost with President Johnson. Nasser had attacked Johnson repeatedly orally in his speeches to the point that Johnson suspended shipments of U.S. wheat to Egypt, and a large portion of the Egyptian population was sustained by U.S. wheat shipments. Johnson cut it out.
How much money at that time was the U.S. giving Israel or giving Egypt?
Israel, several million. Nothing. There was very little aid, mostly loans.
It's not the $3 billion or anything like it is now.
That started much later.
So. There's so much here you can't even begin to get to. I need to get from you, though, the first day of this war. What happened? June 5th. What happened? And what was the extent of the deaths and the destruction?
What's interesting here, Brian, is that what we later became the Six-Day War was conceived by the Israelis as a 2-day war with very limited objectives. The objectives were to knock Nasser down a couple of rungs. First of all, by eliminating his air force, which was the cream of the Egyptian military. Eliminating the air force, and then by conquering the first of 3 defensive lines that the Egyptian army had set up in Sinai. That's all. No taking the entire Sinai Peninsula, no occupying Gaza, no reaching the Suez Canal, no seizing the Golan Heights, no taking the West Bank, and no entering Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. All of that happened in an unexpected, unanticipated way, and to me that's the fascinating part of the war. How did this war snowball into an event that has had this immense impact on us all? And each stage of that war that was unanticipated is a story unto itself.
So, on the day that it started,
right,
when was the first indication that people either in Israel or in Egypt knew that this thing was underway?
Well, Israel devised a military plan which was ingenious and daring and borderline insane. The Israelis determined to send their entire air force, with the exception of 8 planes, on a massive attack, surprise attack against the Egyptians.
So we're talking about 200 planes.
200 planes, all at once. In the book, I refer to it, for American readers, and Israelis will never understand this, as a Hail Mary play,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
The attack was coordinated at a time in the morning when Egyptian pilots had just finished their morning patrols, their dawn patrols, were coming in for coffee, they were sitting down for coffee. The plan was to destroy, first of all, the runways, not the planes, so the Egyptian planes could not take off. Essentially, they'd be bottled on the ground. I interviewed the former chief, the former commander of the Israeli Air Force, Modi Hod, and said to me that a plane in the air is the most devastating combat tool, but on the ground it's completely defenseless. And it was true. They developed special bombs called Durandals that penetrated the runways with a retro rocket and blew up huge holes. Some of them were on delays too, so the Egyptians never knew when they were going to blow up, and they were prepared. And so once the runways were destroyed, all of these Egyptian planes, Soviet supply planes, MiGs, Tupolovs, were trapped. They were sitting ducks, quite literally. And then the Israeli planes, mostly using cannons and rocket fire, not bombs, destroyed these planes one after another. The Egyptians had never bothered to put them under canopies, concrete canopies, so they were all out on the runways, completely exposed. So within about 2 hours, Israel had destroyed well over 300 planes. So it was the largest single aviation victory in military history.
How many planes did Egypt have?
About 400. Ultimately lost all but a handful.
And on this day that it starts, are the Jordanians ready to go?
No. Then what happens then? There's a ground. The Israeli ground forces also moved to take that first line of defense. Now Israel had sent a letter to the Jordanians. Israel at that time had a pretty open connection with King Hussein. In his rhetoric, Hussein could be as anti-Arab, anti-Israel as anybody, but secretly he was meeting with Israeli emissaries. He had open communications to the American and British embassies. The Israelis sent a warning to King Hussein saying, listen, this is between the Egyptians and us, stay out of it. You stay out of it, nothing will happen. But Hussein had a terrible dilemma. He was afraid if he stayed out of it, then the Arab world would accuse him of treason, and they'd kill him. So he had invited the Egyptians to command his army. He put his army under Egyptian command. And the Egyptian commanders had received word in Cairo that the Israeli Air Force had been destroyed, that the Egyptian ground forces were proceeding toward Hebron, and therefore the Jordanian forces were to enter the war immediately. So Jordan opened fire on West Jerusalem. It shelled Jerusalem massively. It shelled the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Jordanian planes strafed lower Galilee. And when Israelis began to fear that the Jordanian army was going to move into West Jerusalem, as it had in 1948, that's when they struck back. That's when they began to strike back on the West Bank and Jerusalem, and that's how that stage of the war developed.
How bad did they hit Jordan when the Israelis?
Well, they hit the Jordanians, by the way, fought very valiantly, in many cases to the last man, the last bullet. But eventually Israeli forces overwhelmed the Jordanians, and they took the West Bank, and in a very bloody battle, they took East Jerusalem.
What kind of planes were the Jordanians flying?
Jordanian planes had Hawker Hunters, British planes, most of which never got off the ground.
What about the Syrians? Were they flying
MiGs?
So they're flying Russian planes?
Russian planes.
You were flying, the Israelis were flying
French
planes, and the Egyptians were flying Russian planes.
Russian planes.
There was one point early in the history of all this, you say the Russians were very pro-Israel, and then they totally flipped.
Right.
What year did they do that?
They flipped. They actually have a date, 1953. They flipped.
What was the reason for it?
Well, essentially because the reason was that the initial motivation for Soviet support for Israel was no longer relevant. The Soviets had supported the creation of Israel as a way of dividing the British Empire in half. Remember, the British in 1940s had their forces along the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the largest British base in the world. The British were also in Jordan. The British were in the Persian Gulf. A British officer in 1945 could get in his jeep, right, and drive from Egypt through Iraq and still be within a British sphere of influence. So the easiest way to put a wedge through the two halves of the British Empire was to create a Jewish state right in the middle. If you look on the map, again, you'll see, especially the Negev Desert divides Egypt from Jordan and Mesopotamia, Iraq. So they supported it. And by 1953, Israel was an accomplished fact. Clearly, the Soviets had more to gain from the Arabs. The United States had become very dependent on Arab oil, and many Arab regimes were then. There was a tremendous political upheaval in the Middle East. There were coups every week, and many of these coups were like the Baathists in Syria and Iraq were pro-Soviet. So it became natural for the Soviets to support these regimes.
We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to the end of all this. In the end, there were, what, 500,000 Arabs that had troops and all involved in all this? Mm-hmm. How many of them died?
About between 15,000 and 20,000 Egyptians died. Several thousand Jordanians, some couple hundred Syrians. The Syrians were the least scathed in this combat. They were the principal factor for precipitating the war, and they pretty much stayed out of it to the last day when Moshe Dayan decided to take the Golan Heights as well.
How many Israelis died?
Between 700 and 800.
How many planes were lost?
20% of the Israeli Air Force was lost. In spite of this tremendous victory, Israel also paid a very, very heavy price. Many planes were lost.
So when this war was over in 6 days, why do you say again this is such an important war and it still resonates today?
Well, as I said earlier, because the map had changed. All right. First of all, you had a relationship between Israel and the United States that didn't exist before, and that was to play a central role in Middle East politics since then, and continues to this day to play that role. Nasser was finished. Moreover, not just Nasser the individual, but the idea of Nasser, that there was going to be a nationalist Arab movement that was going to unite the Arab world. That was debunked. Now there would have to be a new idea, and that idiom was going to be Islamic and not nationalist. The Arab regimes were sick and tired of the Arab-Israel conflict. Let's give it back to the Palestinians. Let the Palestinians fight their own fight from now. And that's when you have Arafat emerging. And then you had the physical reality. It was different. Israel had more than tripled its size in 6 days. Extraordinary. And Israel had the means now to bargain for peace. November 1967, right, a few months after the end of the war, the UN passes Resolution 242, which implies a deal of territory for peace, which remains the basis for all Middle East mediation to this very day. That was the document. This is the founding document. And Israel was later to get a peace treaty with Egypt by giving back the Sinai. If Israel is to ever have a peace treaty with Syria, it is because Israel conquered the Golan Heights in 1967. And even if there is to be a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, it'll be a basis of a territorial deal that arose as direct results of the 1967 war.
You told us that you're still in the reserves, and you have a son now who is how old? That's in the
19.
Is he on active duty?
Very active duty.
Where?
I don't know. He serves in an very elite unit, and I don't know where he is.
How many people in Israel under arms right now?
We have the actual numbers of our standing army is a state secret. It's large, several hundred thousand, all together with the reserves. Israel can field an army of several 100,000 people.
By the way, are the Israeli Arabs in this army?
There are Israeli Arabs who serve in the army. They are under no obligation to serve. There's only one non-Jewish population in Israel, the Druze, who have volunteered to be drafted beginning 1956. But there are great numbers of Bedouins, Israeli Arabs, both Muslims and Christians who serve in the army, and Circassians serve in the army.
You still, by the way, have American citizenship.
I do.
We're out of time. We've got a lot more we could talk about, but 6 Days of War is the title of the book. Our guest has been Michael B. Oren, who is both an American and an Israeli citizen, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.